Hello viewers, welcome to the other session of Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health. I am Professor Rupani. Today we are going to discuss about MEVE 004, that is the industrial sector. So far we have done and then we have learnt about many industries and then how the pollutants are coming out from that industry and polluting the general environment. So today we are going to discuss about industrial risk assessment as well as hazard identification. So how to identify a hazard and how to evaluate that hazard, and then what are the remedial measures we are able to take. So these things we are going to discuss today. So one of the root causes of the workplace injuries, illnesses and incidents is the failure to identify or recognize hazards which are present or that could have been anticipated prior to that operation. So this is a general mistake we can see from the all industries. So a critical element of any effective safety and health program is proactive ongoing process to identify and assess that sort of hazards. So hazard analysis that involves the identification of hazards at a facility and then evaluating the possible scenarios, we can say that, leading to the unwanted consequences. What is the meaning of unwanted consequences? Maybe injuries, maybe accidents, or sometimes loss of lives. So the hazard analysis stage is very important part for the risk management process. So no action can be made to avoid or reduce the effects of unidentified hazards. Sometimes the hazard analysis stage also has the largest potential for errors, for mistakes with little or no feedback of those errors. So the analysis which relies on a structured and systematic approach to identify potential hazards. So ultimately we have to identify hazard, whatever it is the means. So we have to put some mandatory criteria to identify these hazards. So when they can happen, and then what we can anticipate. How do we anticipate before these hazardous explosion or any incident can happen? So there are large number of techniques that can be used to perform this task at various stages during the life cycle of the process, or at the production process, or suppose it is a synthetic process, whatever it is the operation. So to identify and assess hazards, employers, that means the owners and workers, the employer should collect and review the information about the hazards which are present or likely to be present in the workplace. So that is one factor. That means the first responsibility is from the employer side. And the second is need to conduct initial as well as the periodic workplace inspections of the workplace to identify new or recurring hazards. So that also we have to keep it in mind. And the third is there is a need to investigate injuries, illness, incidents and close calls, or suppose if any call is missing, to determine the underlying hazards, their causes and safety and health program, as well as the limitations or the shortcomings. So these things we have to continuously monitor. It is not that once it is happened in 1 year, so we can relax for 5 years. It is not like that. So continuous monitor is required. And also need to group similar incidents and identify trends in injuries and illnesses and hazards reported. Because day-to-day life there are so many changes in the metabolism of the people, as well as some other unwanted operations may happen in any of the industry. So need to consider hazards which are associated with the emergency or non-routine situations. And another thing we have to keep it in our mind is need to determine the severity and likelihood of incidents that could result for each hazard which is identified, and also use this information to prioritize the corrective actions. Those actions should be measurable. And so we have to understand that what is hazard identification. So hazard, how do we identify a hazard prior to that activity happen? So before an event or failure that can be quantified, it must first be identified. So there are number of formal procedures for these processes. So that is a hazard identification is used to identify the possible hazards. That is a HAZOP, that is a HAZOP, that is a hazards and operability studies. It is used to establish how these hazards they might arise in this process, where it is the hazard analysis takes place like this. So what is the hazard analysis? Hazard analysis is the process of analyzing the outcome of the hazard, otherwise known as the consequence of the analysis. So this can be carried out at various levels of the earliest stages of the design throughout the project design cycle. And the preliminary hazard analysis is used as an early means of hazard identification during the design and development of the process. So the method is used to follow up on the hazards that have been identified during the concept hazard analysis. And also it is this approach is similar to splits the process into larger sections, or sometimes it is a major process items and associated lines, and also the heat exchanges. So this technique requires a minimum level of knowledge before it can be performed. So what are the minimum level of knowledge? That is the notes on the dangerous reactions and side reactions, what type of reactions in that particular industry or the particular equipment which we are operating it, and also the data on the hazardous material, and the process of flow diagram that shows the control measures as well as the safeguards, or an initial planning as well as the development ID. And also sometimes the equipment specification should be properly acknowledged on sheets of papers, or we have to paste it on the walls on that particular area. And notes on the inventory levels, this is the most important checklist of any of the industry. And then any available operating information that also has to be displayed. So the assessment that starts with the examination of the dangerous disturbances of that particular industrial plant. Maybe sometimes there are disturbances which are resulting in the rupture or sudden exceeding mechanical limits. So that time that is also most important. And also critical defect in construction, and then flow through the abnormal openings to the atmosphere, and adverse change in a planned product or other releases, and the disturbances that should be further developed until the immediate causes that can be identified. For example, human errors. Sometimes it may happen. The human errors depends upon the person's psychology, or depends upon their health conditions, and also the process item defect, or the design defect sometimes, or control defect, or the change of design intent, or sometimes it is an external threats. So the study can be widened to evaluate the consequences of the deviation and to assign a potential risk to it. So what are the advantages of this method? So there are facilities that building of the fault trees as well as event trees, and the techniques that can be used to, we will learn what are the fault trees and then what are the event trees. So that can be used to identify the events from which the fault trees as well as the event trees can be developed, and also systematically identify the accident scenarios, and a systematic plan which is applied to the process to identify possible deviations that leads to the potential hazards, and also easy to perform. So because of the systematic plan and the low levels of details which are available for its performance, a little expertise is required to apply this technique. And also there are so many aids in the production of inherently safe procedures that also we can adopt. So hazards which are identified in the early concept stages that can be easily evaluated and either designed out, or sometimes additional safety measures that can be added. So are there any disadvantages for this procedure? Yes, some disadvantages are there. They will not identify all the causes. It is common for each and any of the industry. Due to the initial evaluation of the plant, enough information might not be available at that establishment section, and also the causes of the hazards. And also it will only identify and examine the major hazards. when the technique is generally applied, only minimal information is available, and also major hazards can be identified. So next is a HAZOP. So a hazard and operability studies. So what does it mean? It is a technique which is developed in 1970s itself by loss prevention engineers working for the Imperial Chemical Industry in UK. So this procedure is to identify hazards in a process. So that means at one time this was done by the individuals or groups of experts at the project meeting. So this approach is tended to focus on the more obvious hazards, and those are related to the specific expertise of that participants. So in contrast to this HAZOP, what it will do, it involves a deliberately chosen balanced team using a systematic approach. So this method is to systematically brainstorm the entire plan part by part, and to review how deviations from normal design quantities and the performance parameters that would affect the situation. So appropriate remedial action is then obviously employed. So this can be defined as that a full description of the design, that means up to date engineering drawings, line drawings or the line diagrams, and a full working knowledge of the operating arrangements. So it is usually conducted by a team, maybe the comprises the designers and operators like plant operators and the process and the instrumentation, as well as the safety engineer. So a typical small process plant that might be HAZOPed by a team which is consisting of the chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, instrumental engineers, and then loss prevention engineer and chemist, as well as production engineers, project managers, like this. So these many people must be involved in that procedure. So that this procedure will involve to define the scope and objectives of the this operation procedures, that define the documentation which is required, and selection of the team, and the qualifications of that personnel, and prepare for this that is a pre-reading and the carry out the records, and the implementation, the follow up the actions, as well as the recording results. So there are so many phases are there in that particular procedure of the life cycle. So where the HAZOP might be applied like a conceptual design or detailed design, are approved for the construction, as built proposed modifications, and response to regulatory requirements. So this is the one way method, one procedure. And next procedure is the what if analysis. So what is the meaning of what if? This analysis uses a creative brainstorm methodology. So for any operation there must be a brainstorm session. So that brainstorming session definitely gives some the output. So that can be used to evaluate any particular aspect of that process. For simple project only one or two people are required. So there is an increasing complexity, the group size will require to be increased. So these examiners, what they will do, they all are required to be experienced in performing such studies. So it should be so that we can easy to miss hazards, and so that the evaluation would be incomplete. So the assessment ask or assessment procedure are number of questions that begin with what if, to attempt to identify any associated hazards. So normally we will use this. If suppose if this plan fails, next is what if. So these answers can then be further developed by the examining specific conditions. What if the raw material is the wrong concentration? That could be further developed by evaluating. And what would happen if the concentration was doubled? So before the examination begins, a certain level of process information is highly required. So what type of process information is required? The description of the process and the drawings and the operating procedures. So if this review to be performed on an existing plan, then interviews with the operating staff that can be performed along with the site visit. And there are so many preliminary questions which are involved in that. So first they have to make a questionnaire by one of the team members to act as an aid in the initiation of that review. So the results are obviously documented properly in a tabular format that will contain the what if questions which are asked and the hazard or the consequences which are related to that question, that safeguards present in the process at that time and the recommendations if applicable. And the next is the FMEA, that is the failure modes and effects analysis. So this method, the main purpose is to identify potential hazards which are associated with a process by investigating the failure modes, that means previous experiences, why that method has been failed for each process of the items. So it has a difficulty in identifying hazards which are required the failure of more than one process item because of the complex interaction of the failures, and maybe some possible steps of this can be performed during this analysis. That may be a detailed description of the process that is initially required, so that it can be broken down into either a functional or a hierarchical or reliability block diagram. The assessment team that needs a detailed description of the various actions which are performed by each section, like description of their modes of success or failure, and establish the basic principles and the purposes of the study, and the purpose and scope of the assessment that needs to be stated. And also the carry out the study, initially all items should be identified in the various systems or subsystems which are produced by the graphical breakdown of the process. So all the possible failure modes of these items that should be collated. So the most likely failures which are caused by the this type of modes should be identified, and their effects on the process can be evaluated. And reporting the result is the next item. So the reporting items what we have analyzed so far should include the diagrammatic depiction which are produced in this stage, a detailed record of the analysis, or a summary or recommendations, and indicating the possible improvements. And what are the advantages of this procedure? So they may perform a systematic review of the process, a detailed methodology, and is available to assess the plant item by item. Are there any disadvantages of this one? Yeah, one or two disadvantages are there. Most likely it can be time consuming and expensive, but it is a better opportunity to at least to avoid the hazards to some extent. It is a complex process, so there should be many items to be investigated, and difficulty in identifying the hazards due to more than one failure. So it is hard to combine the effect of the multiple failure modes of the combined hazards. So there are they requires a large amount of data is also required. So it needs to be well developed before the technique can be performed. And the next procedure is the FTA, that is the fault tree analysis. So fault tree analysis is it is also one of the graphical representation of the combination of the faults which are leading to a predefined undesired event. And this methodology uses normally the logic gates to show all credible paths from which the undesired event could occur. So this is a determining previously, that means prior determination. So the fault tree is developed from the top down, that means from the undesired top event to the primary events that is initiated the failure, and the logic gates which are indicating the passage of the fault logic up to the tree. This event should be traced back until it cannot be developed further, either due to the lack of knowledge or because of no other causes can be identified. So the logic gates predominantly consist of AND and OR gates, that is a modified version, we can say that. So to indicate if the preceding events that require either one or a number of failures to occur. So once the fault tree has been fully developed, the frequencies or the probabilities that can be designed to each primary